Welcome everyone to another episode of Notes from the Aleph. An Aleph is a high point from which all things are visible, and from our vantage point, we'll be looking at tabletop role-playing games, their design, and the theory behind those designs. Around here, our motto is to be fair, build up, and have fun. I'm your host, GriffinVarro, joined by our editor Theta, our local designer Norman Rafferty, and our good friends and GMs RedRabbit and Lesson Learned. When it comes to tabletop role-playing games, I have 15 years of experience running, playing, and frequently fixing problematic rule sets at the table. Pronouns he, him, they, them. Lessons, why don't you go next?
Yes, I am a YouTuber and streamer and author. You can find me on YouTube on Lessons Learned, which my first episode of the Mass Effect Bridge Edition is out. You might check it out, and I'll probably put it sometime soon on the chat. And also, you can find me on Amazon, The Night It Starts, my short story collection. And finally, last but not least, we are continuing the Dragon Age saga over at here on Twitch on the Lessons Learned 1. The 1 is very important.
All right, Rafferty, why don't you go next?
Hello world, I'm Norman Rafferty, he, him. I work for Sanguine Games, where we make tabletop role-playing games. I've been doing so for quite a while. If you're watching this in the future, I'll look for us at the First Squared convention up there in Wisconsin in April.
All right, and last but not least, Red.
Hey, RedRabbit here. I'm running our Ironclaw game on Wednesdays on the Ractus channel. And I am an enthusiastic game master, a student of narrative and of game design.
Alrighty then. So, to get off to today's topic, it's not hard during a tabletop game to sort of end up with a little bit of downtime for yourself, where your character's not really involved, or you can't meaningfully contribute to what's going on, and so another character who's more specialized in what's going on can step up and make use of their skills. But what if your time never came? What if you only had one particular time where your character choices even came into play? And what if the game was designed in the first place to specifically put you in a box? So today we'll be talking about the fighter. And more particularly, we'll be talking about how the design affects role-playing opportunities. So, I always like to pass this off to Rafferty since he always has a bone to pick about everything. So, why don't you go ahead and tell us? What makes you angry? What grinds your gears?
Alright, so there's a common conceit in role-playing games, which is the idea of balance. What the hell is that? Like, what does that mean?
Balance is where everyone does the exact same thing.
Griffin. Right. Balance is the theory that the game has to be felt challenging in a way that you could actually beat it, but not so much that you overwhelm it. If you always got your way all the time, you'd be a Monty Hall dungeon master. There's a gray hair reference for you. The game would be considered trivial. On the other hand, if the game was impossible and you could just defeat anything just by showing up and rolling dice and diplomancing at it or whatever, it would be considered, if you couldn't do that, if you were just overwhelmed by everything, you just died in the first room, people would quit and stop showing up, or get upset. So there's also the weird thing of where games are divided into combat and non-combat, which is a weird way of wording it. It's like combat and everything else that isn't combat. It's like saying, welcome to my house, where we do murder and non-murder related activities.
Right.
And so there's a weird thing that creeps into a lot of games where they're worried that if we give players too much combat power, they will be imbalanced. And thus we have to take away non-combat power to make them balanced, which is the opposite of what I just said. The opposite of what I just said is you don't want them to feel like challenges are trivial. So instead what you're doing is you're making fighters and anarchs and brujas and other kinds of characters who are really, really good at combat, where combat becomes easy or trivial for them. And anything that isn't combat is extremely difficult and onerous for them. And so you've made your game, by definition, imbalanced, where certain encounters they can just breeze through, and other encounters they have nothing to do.
Yeah. I mean, that ties down to...
Oh,
tacks
you
onto
heard
the
first.
idea that balance is, like you said, it's both the encounter, but also balance between the different characters. Wherein does everybody have a chance to do something at any one time, at least in this session? And I think to me that when people talk about balance, that becomes into mind, because the encounter balance is more in a question perhaps of fairness, which may or may not be something that the game engine that we're working on can actually give you, because the GM can always say, well, rocks fall, everybody dies.
Right. It's not fun if you're the person where you can only fail and someone else can only succeed. You feel gypped by that. It's unfair. I do have a third interpretation, which is that of the balanced human being, because it's funny to think about, like, what kind of characters these also create. Like, the idea that if you become a soldier, all personality and other skills are completely sapped away from you. You're not allowed to know other things if you happen to know how to, like, fire a gun or something, which on its face is goofy and inherently
Well,
demonstrates some of the problems of, like, deciding combat is a thing that needs to be entirely separated.
I mean, as much as I approve of you quoting the Heinlein idea of specialization is for insects, we do have two problems here. First of
Yes.
all, in reality, you do specialize. If you have a medical problem, you go to see a specialist for that part. If this was a military operation, they don't train every soldier in everything. There's the mechanic pool, the mobile surgical pool, the light infantry, the heavy infantry. Certain people are certified for sniping weapons, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I already made fun of the game Lancer for not letting you use equipment until you were certified.
Right, absolutely.
In theory, that comes from that. So in reality, you would, specializations, I have specialties. I can sit, like I'm a self-publisher. I can sit in every chair, but I'm better at certain things than others. Which brings us to the next thing of the party. The elephant in the room that we're not talking about is that almost no game is just two people. It's not the GM and a single player. It's the GM and multiple players. And in this entire balance theory that we've got going on here, everyone's supposed to be something different. Like, most most D&D players wouldn't let all of you be clerics or let all of you be warlocks, even though technically that would make more sense. Like, we're all worshippers of the same god, or we've all pledged ourselves to the same dark entity. I mean, that's why we hang out. You go to when you go to the Franciscan monastery, you don't complain, why is everyone here a monk? So, but more importantly, you would have most parties and most games are specialized to a ridiculous degree. Like Legend of the Five Rings, we've pulled one person from each clan for no reason. We even brought the crabs along, which everyone hates. He's here.
We brought the scorpions that nobody trusts.
Well, the scorpions are the ones everyone hates. The crabs are the ones everybody hates until the scorpions show up. My bad.
Yeah.
But you would have a party that's incredibly polymath where everyone is a specialist, but in a different thing. And so what would happen is when you have to encounter something, your specialist would stand up. If you had books you couldn't read, you put the smart person up. If you have a trap that needs to be bypassed, you put the thief person up. If you have an ogre you need his face pounded to mash, the fighter would stand up. And that's what would happen. Each of you could contribute to this, but you'd have a specialist in this. And almost every role-playing game is built that way. So telling's, it's not bad that you're letting someone specialize in a thing. What's bad is you're telling them, by the way, you must be terrible at everything else.
Right, it's the incompetency in everything else that becomes the issue, because an ordinary person should always be capable of some things, but a lot of design seems to go ahead and take the approach of penalizing you into the ground, of you can no longer functionally do these things.
Well, it's the weird thing with the D&D fighter. It's a really weird one. Like, I kept asking, I thought, like, in D&D 4, they had the skill challenge, which was the theory that when we have a non-combat thing going on, because once again, combat, non-combat, everyone could participate. But I met some players who were complaining, I was playing a fighter. Therefore, whenever a skill challenge came up, I had none of the skills that were involved in it. And then I felt bad because they were forcing me to participate in an activity where I could only fail the rolls they were asking me to do, and I was bringing everyone down. So now we have the D&D 5 solution of, no, we just if it's not combat, you just fail forward. None of this matters. And to me, that's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's kind of like just saying, like, you know, the only thing that matters it's the paradox of the only thing that matters is combat.
Well, I
Yeah.
think also there's another reason why particularly the fighter is the way it is. That it fails by success because it's supposed to be the intro class essentially. It is supposed to be. That's what it asterisk on that. Because I think that was one of the intents of the fighter. That I don't know what to play. Well, play this character, has a sword, whack things over the head. Oh, that seems easy. But it isn't.
No, I would agree with you there because it's Dungeons and Dragons has an identity crisis where, in theory, the fighters are the tanks and the wizards are the glass cannons because they decided this. And, you know, you can say, like, well, the fighter is supposed to be pretty simple because all they do is attack. But in practice, like, the challenges that they have in the game, the fighter is supposed to be area denial. It's supposed to be protecting other people. They're supposed to be choosing targets, based on priority and aggro, a concept not in Dungeons and Dragons, etc. In theory, you know, the tactics are supposed to be pretty complicated. But you're right. We've got this thing going on where people are talking about where, well, the game's not about combat. You know, the game is supposed to be about role-playing and that sort of thing. And what happened was the fighting classes got marginalized to the point where they weren't thieves, so they weren't getting deceit and stealth and lockpicking. And they weren't wizards and clerics who can do everything, but more importantly, get intelligence and wisdom and charisma as their prime stats, which is all social stuff. Like anything that's not killing is in that category. And so you have this problem. Well, and I'm going to end all this by saying, but I've also met people who tell you, like in D&D, that the fighter's just a trap build. Like, you know, like Lesson said, well, they're the introductory class. When you want to play a real game, you pick something like, well, I guess maybe the Ranger, who, by the way, exists to totally make the fighter seem stupid. The Ranger was originally an OP fighter class and still is today.
I definitely see like a high preference amongst like players that I played in the past towards like barbarian and stuff when they're thinking fighter. They usually veer towards that, or maybe paladin, which is like the fighter, but then also has healing magic. It's like, why would you choose something that is the same but has less options?
Well, and pointedly, the paladin
Who would choose fighting man?
Yeah, who would choose? I am fighting man.
Well, and another problem was the lack of multi-classing, because back, you know, Lesson said it was pretty simple, but in earlier versions of the game, you might multi-class in fighter, so you could get some combat skills. If you wanted to be the wizard, I mean, there's spells like Tenser's Transformation that turns you into, you know, a strength 20 demigod. Or True Strike, which his only purpose is to make your weapons hit better. These are only for hybrid classes. You know, they don't, you know, a wizard doesn't care and fighter can't cast spells. So it used to be that it was very common for somebody to, you know, grab a couple extra levels in fighter just so, you know, they could have some fighting prowess at all, but they weren't going to be careers in it. But that's disappeared because D&D 5 has embraced the idea that you'll be one class and one class forever.
Unless you're a warlock, in which case you multi-class with everything else.
Well, you're still one class. Some people are going to chime in and say, what about all the hybrid type stuff? You mean all the optional stuff? All the stuff that you have to ask GM permission for is in separate books and not part of the standard rules? I mean, I enjoy playing Minecraft with mods.
I feel like,
honestly.
I will say that from my experience with 5e, I feel like the general attitude is that multi-classing is not an optional rule, it's a main rule. I don't like it, actually. I think at this point it doesn't make a lot of sense anymore with how the game has expanded, but I feel like a lot of people still play with it. But you got a fair point. In the book, it is listed as an optional rule and not a mainline rule. I think part of this, though, that I want to look at is the perspective. Because it was said earlier, I think by Raf, that the it was said earlier that the when you're talking about balance, right? I'm sorry, I'm very slow today. My thoughts are in a jumble. But yeah, that everyone, you have specialization, right? It's not enough to be... It should be that like everyone is kind of okay at everything, but some people excel at certain things. And the way the game is structured currently, that is not the case. But I will point out that, again, reading the book, skill checks are actually ability checks. So long as you have ability scores that are not in the negatives, you're not being penalized for any of these rolls. You're just not getting the larger bonuses because you don't have skill proficiency in specific areas or as many skill proficiencies as other people.
Well,
like
that might be a fun place to take a microscope too for a second, how the DM decides on like these difficulty classes within D&D, because from a person who's run the game and seen other people run, people usually just make those numbers up and they go, well, I want it to be really hard, so it's going to be 20. And that kind of immediately excludes people who don't have bonuses.
Yeah, maybe they're playing to the knowledge that some people have expertise and proficiency and are going to be rolling at like a +6 or a +8 or a +10. Then you don't want to bother with realistic difficulty classes. So I can see that happening a lot.
Well, I mean, realistic relative to what? Because that's another aspect of balance. Because ultimately, a lot of these numbers, if we go down to numbers, they have a value relative to other numbers, but by themselves, they don't have a value.
Well,
example, that is very true.
Well, we're getting into a weird area here. I mean, like D&D 5 is a lot more generous because D&D 5 did lower the DCs. Like if you play Pathfinder or another D&D 3-4, the DC difficulties for things rapidly outstrip your ability to hit them. Yes. Pathfinder 2 dialed it down a little bit, but still, these DCs can get very high to the point where if you're not trained or specialized, you're not going to hit them.
Right, I'm running a Pathfinder games at like around level 15 right now. DCs are expected to be like 40 to 50. A +20 bonus is the minimum buy-in to even have the chance of succeeding.
Right, and that means not only do you have to be maxed out in skill, you also need specialty gear and feats to do this. Mm-hmm. So, but D&D 5 did dial it down. But like, one thing I want to go back to is the participation issue. It's the idea here that, like I keep repeating, you have a party. So if our party of people, which we never split up, I've already objected to, the party must never split up. Splitting up is death. So you have like this group that always goes everywhere together. And so if you meet someone that you have to use diplomacy with, the person who's playing the fighter says, I will sit this one out. I am but a lowly fighter, and I will not participate in anything that isn't combat. Because someone here is better at everything non-combat than me. It doesn't matter. Any other class would be able to do this better. And so a fighter player sits those out while other players, do the engagement and any sort of roles. And that's by design. And that's kind of what I'm getting at, which is you've basically just told people that if they want to play a combat specialist or be good at combat, the game is telling them you will not be doing anything other than combat. And the reason why I'm making a big issue out of that is because almost like true role players, where we didn't roll dice all night, where we role played and not role played, will say, oh no, the real meat of the game is when we socially interact with people and do other things other than just murder. By the way, here's a class that we specifically told don't do anything but murder.
Well, yeah. I mean, so I think that the game itself is a little bit self-correcting in that way, or maybe it's more like the player base is self-correcting because, like you said, I think if you created a homunculus of the average D&D player, they would feel like, oh, my fighter is not being hamstrung by his abilities during social encounters because social encounters are about, the funny voice and the goofy scenario, and I don't need to roll any dice to participate in that part of the game.
Move box, I move box.
But also, like, the statement, like, the role-playing is the meat of the game isn't necessarily an inherently wrong statement. I mean, like, that's why we're here sitting here doing 4 hours of community improv, right? Because we want to have some of that social interaction. We wanna tell some kind of interesting story, but there are other pieces to the game, and those kind of infringe upon each other. Or
Yeah,
maybe don't even have a good resolution right now, actually.
I mean, I see what Raph is getting at, because ultimately we're approaching this from a designist perspective, and as designers, this is an obvious flaw. In the execution of the game, though, I think it's less of an obvious flaw, but again, it depends on how much you focus on the mechanics of the game.
Well, I mean, the snide remark. I mean, I apologize. The remark I usually make for that is the problem that you are not having is not a problem.
Right. Yeah.
Which is the idea that I agree that the games are self-correcting. One way the games are self-correcting is no one's playing a freaking fighter.
Well, there you go. Right. No one's.
Right.
Yeah, if everyone
Using the
stops
class.
playing it, then it's not a problem, right?
And to stop ragging
Quote,
on D&D for a bit, there's also the problem of what happens when the game sculpts you this way. I mean, some of you might be bigger L5R experts, but I'm also thinking of Vampire the Masquerade, where if you're playing an Anarch or a Bruja, they tell you in your source material, you're a brutish, nasty fighter, punchy guy. You get extra brute force powers, and you're really good at combat. So they've already built into the game that that's your role. So if you showed up at the game with one of those characters, it's one of my favorite lines of, I am role playing. I am role playing this asshole. The game. I always want to rephrase this. The game put the idea in my head that I would play a Bruja. The game had Bruja in it. I didn't show up and say I want to play, a Spanish insult, because that's what that is. The game told me I could be this, and then I followed the directions, and I am this. So now that I'm at the table and I built someone who has all this cool stuff, I'm going to look for reasons to use it in the game, and to blame the players for, we told them we were going to play this game, and then they're doing what's in the game. I mean, I'm always against that. It's kind of like, why was this in the book if we're not going to do it?
Right, and I think it's worth looking at, like, the later edition, Requiem 2nd Edition, which is a different system, where I think maybe it partially solves this, because it makes sure that each of these vampire clans has, like, a distributed amount of power. You could choose to be that sort of fighter-y role in any of them, but you'll also then have access to a tool that can unlock other areas of the game for you.
And I always feel bad of saying, like, it's Requiem did make a lot of changes, but is it still the current version? Because all the hype and stuff that I see is all about the 20th anniversary release, and they've gone back to Anarchy.
They're still doing them in parallel, honestly. Requiem is like one set, and then Masquerade's the other.
And I'm being cynical of, like, saying, like, well, they're still doing everything. I mean, they're still making the Star Wars Legends books too. You can still. Timothy Zahn had a re-release of his entire Star Wars thread, but
I would say, though, with both of them, even Masquerade, like, because of the nature of their point buy, it does become at least slightly hard to make a character who is completely incapable of being in one other arena other than your primary one.
Well, yeah,
you will have enough points to end up distributing, and at least roll, like, your 3 dice, get 1 success, and say, yeah, I can drive a car.
Oh, Vampire is definitely better at that, because it's a point-based game instead of a skill-based game. And
it's an example where design could be good, maybe.
Yeah, at character creation, they do tell you, okay, physical, mental, and social. You have to spend some points on social skills.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, D&D is the outlier where if you pick fighter, they'll just have a big void where anything other than athletics is concerned. And it's really weird to see, like. That's why I'm making a big deal about that, because that's the big elephant in the room. That's dominating the conversation of the game, and to a lesser extent, some of the other games aren't as bad about it. But I mean, this gets into the larger issue of also the idea that being good at fighting somehow means you have to suck at everything else, which is a very gamery thing. Because if you look at a lot of fiction, especially the anime that I'm into, you can have people who are really badass combatants, but can also do other things other than just fight. There's
Right, like the
weird-
primary thing you could look at is nearly every protagonist is good at fighting, a competent and charismatic leader, and usually probably smart at something.
right, like Daniel, like everyone hailed the James Bond reboot, and Daniel Craig is like he's crashing through walls. He's beating people to death with his bare hands. And he's still, and any gun he picks up, whether it's a pistol or a submachine gun, he instantly knows how to shoot it. You know,
Oh yeah, he's a murder machine.
James Bond is a power fantasy. Let's not, I like the Daniel Craig ones, but they're still power fantasy movies.
And the tabletop role-playing games are
also power fantasies. But
I mean, yeah. Well, they might not be. I mean, like one of the things I like to get back to is, some of these were roguelike games where you started with some garbage and your goal was to see how long you could live with this until you got to be somewhere special. But people don't play. That's not how they sell you on these games. When you don't read the introduction to a modern game and it says, okay, roll your dice and whatever you come up with, try to live to the next level. Make a game out of it. Try to have fun. It's a challenge. They don't say that anymore. They say make the character that's part of your dreams. If something in here doesn't match your dreams, change it. Ask your game master for permission to change the game to make it more like what you like. That's modern gaming, and that's what we need to roll with.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. The perspective has changed over time, and the designs maybe haven't entirely caught up on that angle.
I think that's a very good point to make, in fact, because if you look at the kind of stuff that you will be doing within the context of a dungeon crawl adventure, I think there's plenty of application for fighters to contribute outside of just fighting things, as I said, based on like ability checks versus skill checks and stuff. If you've got a high strength and a high constitution, or maybe there's a high dex in there as well, you will automatically have a baseline competency at knocking down doors, and lifting heavy objects, pulling people up ropes, like the kinds of stuff that you'll probably be doing in like a straight. But you'll
make your int, your whiz, and your ka your dump stats. And so if that's not going on, you'll be bored.
Right, but that's my points too, is that I think a lot of that prejudice maybe stems from the fact that people are using D&D to tell very, very different stories than they were 10 or 20 years ago, right? Like they're using a game that was designed to be a war game in a dungeon fighting monsters, which are sometimes dragons, and they're using it to tell stories where they're flying in airships and being like steampunk diplomats to weird Aztec warriors. Like it has expanded so far outside of the realm of what the mechanics were set up to do, and then people look at the fighter and say like, well, what the hell?
So today's topic is how Final Fantasy is actually the most popular RPG on the planet.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it didn't really, I'm glad we had this because it didn't really occur to me. I forgot that multi-classing was a huge component of earlier versions of D&D. I don't have a problem with the modern version of gaming where people pick a single class and run it forever. That started with 4th edition, and 5th edition carries the torch for that. Mm-hmm. Because, I've seen some of the more modern games like Powered by the Apocalypse and Blades in the Dark that, like, it helps characters focus. Like, this is a fantasy, and so it's a good idea. Look at this. Okay, this is what I am. But those games that have those sorts of playbooks or classes, the better ones, give you a lot to do. We already talked about how the ranger is more attractive than the fighter because the rangers get spellcasting and wilderness abilities and tracking abilities, or the barbarian gets wilderness abilities, and that kind of stuff. They get special stuff that they can do with some application for the story. And so, where the fighter doesn't get that, that wasn't a big problem when you were multi-classing. You just say, I'm just going to pick up a few level, or I'm going to dual class in fighter, just so I can survive. That wasn't a big problem back then. But now in the modern game, which is the one-stop shop, and they want you to get it. Now it's the really huge problem of not only can you not get this other stuff, but like as Red said, a lot of people are just multi-classing anyway and pulling that out. And if that's what people are doing, I think we need to re-examine the game of. I mean, I'm always the fan of. We should write the game the way people are actually playing it.
Right, and if people are just constantly a la carting all of their abilities out of everything, maybe that is the design people actually want to have.
I
Okay,
mean,
so
I'm
that's
gonna
interesting.
yeah, I'm going to stand up and say if it's optional, that means you are saying that a game that the designers are telling some players you may not be permitted to do this. I mean,
Yeah,
that's what I'm getting at
as-
with because a lot of people look at options, they say, "Oh, well, you can just do it because it's optional." No, if it's optional, that means you have to ask permission, and that permission could be denied. In fact, the book is even like encouraging them to deny you because they put it in optional because they already said
Yeah.
everything could be changed. So, if they wanted you to do it, no questions asked, or thought you could do it, they wouldn't put a warning in front of it.
Yeah, as someone who has run a lot of games, I mean, I've got like 5 years experience now with 5th edition D&D, which is not as much as some people have, and I didn't touch 4th edition, but I can say that I have not run into a group yet that has assumed that multi-classing was not on the table. So I do think that is the way that people approach it, but I think this is an interesting thing too, because, and this might be popularity bias, but I have not run into people like theory crafting or making player builds in the same way they do in D&D in point buy games like Vampire, right? I think of course there's always going to be a little bit of like, oh yes, I'm going to try to maybe max out this particular skill pool or do something that will synergize to a discipline, again using the Vampire analog. But I feel like there's something unique about D&D that people want to, what Griff said, kind of do this a la carte thing. But I wonder if that is a side effect of the fact that there are these set lanes in the classes. There are these classes that are designed to balance with themselves and with another party of mono-classed characters. And maybe that's what makes people think about character building in the way that they do with multi-classing. Like, people look at abilities from Class A and Class B and say, ooh, I could break the game with these two. And so I'll create this, like, chart I'm going to follow.
Right, or even simpler, it's like, oh, well, we didn't pick up a rogue character, I'm going to multi-class into rogue so we have access to these abilities. And I think we discussed some of this back when we were talking about, like, different ways to design, like, character levels versus points and stuff, that the point of these, of classes is to give you those narrow channels to say, like, hey, here's a really simple thing for you to do, this is a role we're saying is needed in the game. D&D is saying, we need fighters, we need wizards, we need clerics, we need rogues. And everyone who comes to every D&D table goes, all right, each of us has to be one of these.
Yeah, right.
Almost unerringly.
Well, you've got that paradox related to our earlier discussion of, why don't we start awesome? Why do I have to start as a scrub? It's like, well, you have to level up. What does that mean? That means that as you overcome challenges, you become better at overcoming the same challenges. And like you've just said, like a point-based game or one that has a little more flexibility would be, okay, when I leveled up, I got tired of all those traps hitting me in the face. I'd like to get trap finding skill because I'm sick and tired of traps. But you'll have the problem where in D&D, 5, the way it's written, it's like, no, leveling up happens completely divorced from your experience. It's like if that fighter hung out with you and you did all the diplomacy and united the elves against the orcs and the psionic menace and banished the Gith from your landscape, congratulations, you can swing a sword better.
Right, yeah, you could literally be on break in the tavern, you got the experience for the session, somehow you leveled up.
Well, no, what I mean is the experience you get is not related to what you were actually doing. If you, as a fighter, blundered into a bunch of traps and had to do a bunch of social situations, got most of your experience through story rewards instead of combat rewards, you'd still be leveling up in combat. Without access to... this is something I was pointing out. Feats are not... feats are an optional rule in D&D.
Also an optional rule.
Yup. Mm-hmm. And also usually goes to the table with the assumption that they're going to be there. Yeah.
Well, I mean, almost everyone's going to use them, but they're technically optional. Which means that the designer, we have to assume the designer's intended you would just increase your stats. In fact, you have to, if you can't increase your stats if you pick feats, which is, screw the fighter again.
But you also max out on them very quickly too.
Yeah. So if it was a dump stat now, it's a dump stat forever. Ha.
Right. Before we get too far away from it, though, I want to mention something interesting that I think I realized about the class structure. You're saying that, like, when you're leveling up, it's not reactive to the actual content of the game. And I think that's an important part of the D&D design, specifically because it allows people to make those theory crafts regardless of what the game, what's happening at the table, which I've harped on this before as a big sticking point for me, is the fact that the game kind of works like there is a huge solo play component to the game. That is people theory crafting and stuff. People who will sit, alone in their room with their books and they will just like gen up PCs and things. You can't really do that if the advancement of a character is related to the unknowable events that will be presented to you in the story. And again, I think that's the fun for a lot of people, is having that kind of authorial control over their character. And I think classes play into that in a big way.
Well,
I think we've also talked a bit about, like, wait, shouldn't people be communicating about what's going to happen so you can actually create a character who's supposed to be involved in the story?
And I would agree, but I think, like, as I mentioned, I've been a designer for years now, and only recently did the concept of trap builds come up, which is really, this is the dark side of what Red just said. On the one hand, it's nice that I can plot my entire character growth out for the future. On the other hand, now you have people, like, instead of the hard scrabble roguelike permadeath, where whatever happens, that's how we level up. Upgrades like spells and items that we find are going to be completely random. Now, because you have a lot more control over your feats and your abilities and that kind of stuff, you can plot what your level 20 is going to look like as soon as you sit down at the table. And as I mentioned in an earlier one, now not only are we killing time until I get to level 20, which is where I want to be, your character growth is now completely divorced from the experience, because you've plotted your entire character arc away from the story.
Yeah. No, let's be clear. I didn't offer that as like, oh, here's an interesting good thing. Yeah. It is the dark side. I think that kind of solo play is pretty much antithetical to everything that I'm looking for out of an RPG. I think a lot of the problems that I have with the way people play D&D comes from this solo, selfish, self-interested. I mean, that's harsh. I'm using harsh language, but ultimately, like, people fell in love with this game because of this authorial promise that it makes you. I think that you miss out on a lot of what the games can be because their shared experiences is what makes them great. When you're afraid that your plans are going to be interrupted, that your 1 to 20 character will run into something you didn't expect, whether that be bad, like they die, or even like good, like they have a new like narrative plot twist or NPC that matters to them, people are afraid of those changes. They don't want you messing with their action figure. Like, they don't want you playing with their toys, which I think defeats the purpose of a lot of what these games have to offer. So
I do think there's one extra angle here, which is like the utility of choosing to do so, of like saying, I am following these rules as stated explicitly. I have my 1 to 20 character build. And that comes specifically with like random online pickup groups, which, if you're going to be gaming with 5 strangers, you don't know how they'll react, you don't know what their interpretations are, you don't even really know what they're planning. You just come to the table, say, I got this interesting idea. It is as legit as can be, regardless of interpretation. Here it is. That's what I'm doing.
I'm going to stop you right there. Because when you said it's as legit as can be, no. When you game with randos, they'll show up and say, this is my build. And you'll ask, hey, how did you get like a plus 15 combat bonus? And they'll go, well, I took this optional rule, layered it with this optional rule, and got this other one from this other obscure book, like Magic of Faerun, which is another party book, and combined it with an errata I found on a forum. In other words, that's why I'm always complaining about options.
You are absolutely right.
Right.
But though I was at least trying to assume, like, in good faith, but the bad faith actors totally exist and appear all the time.
I don't want to call those people... I don't want to call them bad faith actors, because we earlier said, some people interpret optional as, well, this is a game where I just have to ask permission. But now we're in the problem of when the random people show up, they'll have done all those optionals. And now we've got what I've been complaining about, toxicity. Which is
there we go.
The player shows up and says, hey, this is the character I wanted to play. And the book has rules that say I can do this unless you are bad dad and say no. And then you've got the GM there who
Bad
has to be bad dad or bad mom or bad parent or whatever, and say, and look at that and go, oh, well, I'm not comfortable with that, and that's optional. So let's have an argument over whether you should have those or not. And many people in that case would blame the players, or why don't you just be better players? Why don't you just not argue? And I'm over here in the designer seat saying,
this argument has been designed.
You did
this
this.
wouldn't be happening if they didn't sell people a bunch of books with a bunch of stuff in it that says, you gave us money, so our book says you can do this unless a big meaty GM says no.
Right. And it means that players are going to inevitably be attracted towards GMs that let anything go, right? And I mean, as a GM, maybe this is a biased perspective, but then I think that leads to games where people are like, we're not having fun. I'm not having fun because this player, who I respect as a person, is playing a character. He's playing a homebrew blood hunter mixed with artificer, and he's got weird vampiric turret guns that leech people's health from across the room, and my fighter abilities can't keep up. And then it's okay, so how do you fix that problem? It replaces obvious problems with non-obvious problems with even more complex solutions.
Which brings me to the whole point I was saying before about how eventually the game defeats itself, and also why I hate black books. But that's just me.
I do love that point though, because it comes to the final trap of the trap build of the fighter. The fighter eventually is eclipsed by everyone else who is not a fighter. They become the worst fighter eventually.
Oh, tragic.
That is the ultimate trap. They aren't even good at what you've been sold to do.
Which is weird because in theory, D&D and its entire theory of you go into a dungeon and get into small skirmishes on a tiny map, in theory, it's built around the fighter, because in theory, you need... They're the only class... Well, I shouldn't say this. They're supposed to be the class that gets the best damage output and the best weapons and the best armor. They're supposed to be the class that has all of those ideal, and no class is supposed to outshine them in just sheer raw power. Notice I said supposed, because you can go through the books with your optional builds and find ways that paladins can smite, barbarians can rage, and rangers can shoot an unlimited amount of arrows and then fight with 3 swords at once. Some of you
sword
found
juggler.
Yeah. Dragonborns of Tales. I know at least one of you is doing that. So, right.
Not canonically, but
Oh, just wait till you see Pathfinder. There's tail weapons all over it.
You just gotta ask your DM. Just gotta,
DM
Now ask the question about how natural attacks mix with weapon attacks.
Oh boy.
We have 5 pages for that.
So I guess if I had to conclude all of this, basically is what I say is we should be looking at other games, especially everyone take a drink. Rafferty's gonna mention Warhammer again. Yeah, because one of the things I really Warhammer goes back to the 80s, and one of the best parts about Warhammer showing up was they didn't have a fighter class in Warhammer. Everybody, if you want to play, you had to be a mercenary or a bounty hunter or a vermin catcher, or a guard or a militia man. Militia is one of my favorites because you get combat skills and you have a job. But they were really good. And this is Warhammer. This is the setting where everybody goes, isn't this about grim and dark and chaos? Yes, from day one, they said, look, everyone has to have something to do other than murder. Everyone has to be a real person with a real job. And they said that from day one in their class-based system. That's one of the things I really love about that. And it modified our designs. It was basically just saying it's only like this in D&D, and it's only like this in D&D to solve to deal with things that don't exist anymore. And really, I wanted to get a big umbrella away from this, where I've seen game designers who get obsessed with the idea that if something's really good at combat, we have to take away other powers. And I think the real takeaway that we're supposed to have from this is if you want players to do other things, you have to give them the ability to do other things. If you give them only 1 or 2 things to do and say to balance them will take away other things, you've got Hammer theory all over again, where now the only thing they ever do is that one thing. And, and if the only thing they can get better at, they'll get better at it. Why? If there's an experience point system, people will level up. They will. It's a rule. And
Yeah.
so, if you want people to be diverse, your game has to make them diverse.
Yeah, I think like the standout quality here with the career system is definitely asking, so wait, why is it that you have a sword? What are you actually doing with it? And not just the assumption that the only thing you can do is hold that sword.
Well,
Yeah.
why does the fighter still exist when you have the paladin, the ranger, and the barbarian? Like what makes the fighter, real?
What makes them special?
What makes and the answer is nothing. They're really shitty unless you take Eldritch Knight, which is a big mistake.
I took Battlemaster.
I mean,
Silence.
So, a friend of mine, we were just actually conversing about the fighter class. Shout out to Joe. Sometimes he listens to the podcast. So if you're listening, Joe, but he brought up something that the original design of the Battlemaster in 5e, this could be hearsay, but he said that it was like every character or every subclass in the fighter pool, I guess, had different Battlemaster maneuvers, but then they were afraid that would make it too like, that would make things too complicated or something. So, and they wanted to differentiate it from 4th edition. So they took all those maneuvers and put them into Battlemaster. And I was like, damn, if they broke that up and sprinkled it across the different fighter subclasses,
I
I'd
gotta
be okay
say,
with
that's
that.
the thing that frustrates me the most about moving from 4th edition to 5th edition. They took away the Warlord, a character who sure can have a sword, but actually had a purpose.
Oh, the Warlord's one of my favorites. No, I can tell you more. In the D&D 5th edition playtest, the Battlemaster powers were in other classes. Like the Rogue class got those hero special dice you can use to roll to modify your rolls. And I think what happened was it breaks players' brains if you mix dice. Like if you have a D20 and you add a D6 to it, they get all upset. And once again, I'm not here. As a designer. You have to write the game the way people will actually freaking play it.
Mhm.
And so, like that, it was too complicated for most people. So they put it as an optional but they were interesting ideas. The idea that I could have physical dice in front of me that I could pick up and throw at the table to get combat advantages. The nice part about that was tangible. You had the dice in front of you, so did I use my parry die yet? Oh, it's here in front of me, so I haven't. It was a nice idea, but it stands out in D&D 5th edition as what 5th edition is not, because a lot of people, when they praise 5th edition over 4th edition, they say 5th edition's not a stupid computer game anymore, where it's nothing about war. You can role play in 5th edition. And so I'm glad you brought up the Battlemaster, because the Battlemaster stands out as that. No, Battlemaster's the war game, because it's the guy who gets all these special little abilities they can tap to manipulate, like their dailies and at wills and encounters and all this weird fiddly stuff. That honestly, if the fighter was supposed to be, as Lesson said, if the fighter was supposed to be the simple default class, Battlemaster ain't it.
No.
Right, but it also is the thing that actually makes it interesting or even worthwhile playing, because if you were to play like the champion option, which is you just get like a little bit better at critical hits, not even like meaningfully, it'd be a total snooze fest.
Well, that's also why we talk about trap builds. I mean, come on, other classes can cast spells.
Yeah.
Most of them actually can cast spells.
Why the ranger casts spells is just totally
The rogue can cast spells.
Why does the ranger get spells? Where does this come from?
Nowhere.
Well,
it is
wasn't
whole
the original
laws.
Ranger, you had to have like 4 levels of wizard or something like that to be a
Okay,
ranger
the
back in
original
day?
ranger,
Man.
the original ranger is motherfucking Aragorn, because Aragorn is a ranger, and he was really badass. And when the original guy wrote up Ranger, because it wasn't Gygax, they later just put it in there. He made it the world's most OP class. They started with 2 hit dice instead of 1, because fuck you. So they started with the most hit points. They could use all of the weapons. We can use all the weapons in the game. We get wilderness skills, and we can cast spells too. Sure, why not? It was like ridiculously OP, and then later they decided, and they're really good with 2-handed weapons, because wizards good with 2-handed weapons.
Oh, that's exactly where they got the spell casting from, where they're crossing the river into Arendelle, I think, right? The first city that they go to.
It's
for the main meeting where the water rapids come through, and so they wrapped up 2 characters into one mega character. That's what happened.
It's so OP, and it's a legacy feature, and basically what we're coming at is look, if you wanted to be the fast, agile fighter, you'd be a ranger. If you wanted to be the fighter who cares about other people, you'd be the paladin. And if you just want to beat the crap out of people, you'd be the barbarian. But
Yet I find a lot of people who hate the ranger for some reason. I feel like maybe.
Oh, I hate it.
Yeah.
So that's the subject for a different podcast, but it's because they removed the exploration aspect of the game, but they kept in the exploration character and gave them a bunch of abilities that completely remove any challenge from exploring things. So,
well, yeah, but mostly, I think the conclusion that we come away from this was that, I mean, I'm glad you pointed out multi-classing, because it's like, it's this weird one. Rafferty shakes his fist at, like, the game should be written the way you actually play it. Look, if you're all fucking multi-classing, then the game should be written with multi-classing assumed as a default, and it should be written to be clean and commonly understood, and so casual players can understand it, instead of making it a bizarre homebrew that some GMs will just flat out ban it because someone showed up with your, what was that, blood?
Oh, the Blood Hunter Artificer.
Blood Hunter Artificer with a machine gun that sucks blood at range. I mean, on the one hand, that sounds really badass. On the other hand, that would have scared the crap out of, like, many game masters.
It scares me.
Right.
I mean,
and so, yeah, it's kind of like, yeah, in fact, why would you play a fighter when you can play an artificer? Because if you want the best gear, you play a fucking artificer.
I mean, I got my own issues with the artificer.
Right. But I mean, but this also gets to the, I mean, basically the big wraparound we want to say is, like, we're tired, I'm sick of games that assume that high because I haven't even bitched about, like, Aberrant, for crying out loud. I mean, I guess I should just, last comment, superhero role-playing games suck.
Sure, yeah.
And
good last comment.
I always bring that up for, like, games like Aberrant, because Aberrant made all the combat powers extremely expensive. So if you wanted, like, super strength or super invulnerability, they cost shitloads of points. But if you wanted mind control, it was so cheap. Like, you could just buy it and you're mind controlling entire crowds. And it was so weird to me, because it's kind of like, mind control is more game than balanced. Like, a guy who's super strong could only pick up one car and throw one car. The person who can control an entire crowd has basically won the game.
What do you mean our players are doing more things than just punching each other?
With mind control, I could get someone to punch.
Yep.
Now you're thinking like the rules wanted you to.
Right. So it's the weird thing where, honestly, when it comes to game balance, combat is not your problem. Combat is one of the simplest things to control in gaming. Maybe we should do another panel on that or whatever. Combat is easy and easily controllable. Everything non-combat, where people are diplomancing or talking their way through stuff or failing forward, all that kind of stuff, that stuff is difficult, requires a lot more design. So harshing on the combat people is not your solution.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and move on to lessons. Lessons, what do you got to wrap up this all with?
Wow. I mean, I think everything that has been said has been said. I think that we basically are looking, because I'll focus on the splat. Essentially, we're looking at the edge of the end of 5th edition and the reboot for 6th edition, or 5.5, or whatever you want to call it.
Oh, yeah, it's coming.
Because you got to fix all the loopholes and all the problems that were there before, and we got to sell you all the books again.
Hooray.
What about you, Red?
I don't know. I never really felt like the fighter was a big problem. I think it's a problem when you look at it from the perspective of people who are comparing the new classes to this class that came out 5 years ago, 6 years ago, and asking why there's not more parity. The reason is because you wanted new stuff. You wanted new stuff and better stuff. There's not a lot of comparison to be made there. And I think fixing the class would mean a lot more than just updating the abilities at this point, because, like we pointed out, I think the class is just a serious mismatch for the way a lot of people expect to be playing the game today. So yeah.
All right. So that's going to go ahead and be it for today for Notes for the Aleph. We stream episodes bi-weekly Fridays at 2 p.m. Eastern. You can come join us live at twitch.tv/Ractus. We also stream and record weekly tabletop games at the same channel. You can come join those when they start at 10 a.m., 2 p.m., and 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Times on Sundays and Wednesdays. Norm Rafferty here is a partner and writer for Sanguine Games. Check out sanguinegames.com, join us on the Reddit and Twitter, and look forward to the upcoming Book of Corals Ironclaw expansion book. Don't forget to check out RedRabbit and book him for a game over at startplaying.games as RedRabbit. And of course, be sure to check out Lessons Learned at Lessons Learned 1 on YouTube and Twitch. Check out all of his series, and of course, check out his books over on Amazon. And of course, as always, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, do all those other YouTube things, and come see us all again. Until next time.